All right, so welcome everyone, and thank you to be here today. I'm Pascal Blanchette, an engineer with MaestroVision. I will be talking to you tonight about various projects we've worked on, focusing on the ways that we do workflow improvement. And I will give a few actual examples during the presentation of how we did it and actual example of what happened when we did those kinds of projects, but I'll be focusing mostly on the way that we do it, the approach, and the highlight of what is important when doing that kind of work. So first of all, we'll talk a little bit about why is workflow improvement needed in today's world. We'll go into a bit more detail about what exactly is workflow improvement, or process flow, as some other people call it, because sometimes there's a bit of confusion as to what it is exactly and can stand for multiple things in some people's mind. We'll talk about the benefits that you'll get out of those, and then we'll go a little bit more into the nuts and bolts of how we actually do the improvement itself, with the first phase, which is the analysis, and the second phase, which is implementing solutions and the changes that comes with it. And we'll finish with some questions. If during the presentation some of you do have some questions, feel free to raise your hand and I'll be happy to answer them as we go as well. So workflow, why exactly is it needed? Because most people work in our case in broadcast industry, we have relatively complex equipment. This would be kind of a sample station. You have cameras, you have production switchers, you have various servers, various equipment connected, editing station. And in the beginning, it's kind of neat and all planned out and laid out logically, and everything connects. There's lots of equipment, lots of conversion, but it's pretty straightforward. But as technology evolves, time passes, new people are involved, staff change, all of those little things that life brings us, the actual TV station that we all know and exist today don't look like this, but a little bit more like this. Things have been added left and right, and on top of this, we added this. This is going to be changed by that other version, and it becomes a little bit messier. What is kind of fascinating to note, however, is it still works. Even though it's very complex, and if you look at it this way, you're like, this is completely crazy and it cannot work. But in actuality, it does work, because if it did not, well, you wouldn't be broadcasting and we would all be out of a job. So it works, but whenever you have to do a change, you have to be very careful, because you never know when you pull a wire, what else is going to come with it. So why does it become ever so complex like this, and more complexity is added? One of the reasons for it is the way of the trends of the change that has been brought lately in video and how we consume them. A few things that are new to the industry. Video on demand. These days, everyone expects to have video on demand. If you tell a 20-year-old that he needs to be at home every night at 7 p.m. in order to watch his show, he's going to look at you as if you're a dinosaur and wonder under what rock did you crawl out of? Because everyone expects to have video on demand these days. 20 years ago, that was not even on the spectrum of things. Another company that did a lot of changes in the broadcast industry, Netflix. We all know that they've basically put video store out of business, unless you're one of the few people who still have one or two around you. Most people don't see any video rental stores anymore. And if you look at the growth of their subscriber, in 2013, it was 30 million subscribers, which is a pretty good number. 2021, they were at 220 million subscribers. So you see in those about 10 years, well, not 10 times more, but close to 10 times. So that is a business growth, few companies have. YouTube, we're talking about 2 billion users every month who use YouTube. And there's 500 hours of new content every minute. And that's a statistic from 2020. Of course, of those 500 hours, most of it is very crappy and no one wants to watch it. But out of those 500 hours, there is a few hours of interesting content that people will actually watch. And it adds up every minute. So in the end, you do have a large variety of shows, of content that will interest most people. So all of those game changers, they come and they put pressure on traditional broadcast stations to do more and to be able to meet those changes. but you still have to support the existing infrastructure and the existing ways of doing things. So you can't just put everything aside and change. You need to adapt new product offering within your existing products that you already have. So and all of these changes, also keep in mind, they're even more expected of everything that we talk about, the C generation. So everyone that has been basically born since the 80, 85, that are in the 20 up to 40 age range. Those people, they've been born with technology, so they expect their provider to have access to those cutting edge technology and to offer them some things that they expect and want to see. So you need to always improve your workflow and to learn to do more, because as we said before, if you just pile up on top of existing things, it works, but at some point it becomes so complex you lose track, you lose money because it's more complex, you have extra equipment that you don't necessarily need in the end, and you need to maintain all of those equipment, and you need more staff, and it's kind of a perpetual loop where you either improve yourself and adapt, or you just pour more and more money into it. Before going further, I'll touch a little bit about what workflow is not, and then we'll go about it, what workflow is. So workflow is not a software or specific technology. Sometimes, people will tell you, oh yeah, I have a workflow engine, I use this software or that solution. Workflow is not an actual software. It's not either a way of moving files or managing them. So it's not an asset manager, it's not a file transfer protocol, it's not a cabling diagram. And one thing also that sometimes people wish was true is that, unfortunately, workflow is not a quick way of saving money. It will allow you to save money, but it's more about the mid to long-term run, not about tomorrow, because there are lots of changes involved and the actual benefit comes further down the road. Also, workflow is not only a concern of high-level management. Sometimes people, say, "Oh, but I'm not the CEO or the CTO, so I'm more of a mid-level management." We can do workflow improvement at multiple levels, and it's all about, deciding what's the scope of the work to do, and it can be centered about just, if we take a broadcast example, just about how master control works, or it can scope the entire business, including production, and even going all the way to sales when there's commercial sales involved with advertisement sales involved in the station. So it's all a question of what scope are we looking for. So what workflow is? Basically, workflow, also it's important to remember, is not specific to the broadcast industry. It's been used since about the last 50 years by various industries. Manufacturing plants have been the first one who started using workflow analysis to improve the way that those mechanical belts and the way that worker work when they're all at one after the other. They've been the first one who developed those techniques. Then the chemical and transportation industries has been using it also not long after the manufacturing industry has. And various business development businesses have also been using it because it's a way of streamlining the way we work, whatever we work with. It can, however, be applied to broadcast, and we're able to have lots of benefits from it as long as the person doing the workflow improvement is aware of the reality of broadcast, which, like any other industry, there's some shared concept, but there's also some very specific things about broadcast industry. One of them obviously being video and the technological aspect in this case. So workflow is all about information and identifying how it flows. So basically, who produces what and who is waiting on what pieces of information. It's about knowing your business needs, and once you know what you need and you know how information flows, it allows you to identify and solve the bottlenecks so that you don't have one person waiting half of his time on a bunch of other person while he could be doing something else. So overall, it's about finding ways to work better, more smartly, and not simply trying to add more staff to do more. So now we'll talk a little bit more about how we do actual workflow optimization. There's basically 3 phases. First one being establishing the goal, and then we'll talk about the other 2 afterwards. So establishing the goal, I've talked a little bit about it a few minutes ago, and when I said the workflow can have the various scope, but it's important to establish also what is the end result, because sometimes the end result, management wants to simply save time because they want to allow to have the same amount of workers, but they want to do more. So in order to do more, you need to basically work more smartly, because well, the answer that working more means simply overworking your employee. That's usually not the long-term good solution. It never works. Many people have tried it and it doesn't end well. So usually you need to find ways of changing the way that people work a little bit, so that it's not just about doing more. It's about, you remove a few useless tasks, and that frees up time for those people to do more high-quality tasks, or actually more tasks that have a better added value to them. So it's really about added value, actually. So it allows you to meet new needs, new technologies, add new product offering, and all of that. And it can also be about expanding or changing the business. For instance, you can be opening up a new station, or there are extra working locations. And it's not because you have a new station in a new market that you necessarily have more staff to send there. Maybe you want the same staff to manage one extra station. Then you need to find ways, for them to be able to do that extra work. And some work do scale nicely, some other are a bit more tricky to scale. Also, remote working. I know in the last 2 years, most of us have been very much in contact with remote working. It's been a new reality for many. One of the ways of doing remote working that people were thinking of is simply, take the way I'm working in the office, but I'm bringing it home and working exactly the same way. It's not exactly optimal. Some of it works that way. Some other ways of working do not simply translate well to other concepts of working like remote work. So you may need to change your workflow and your business flow a little bit in order to adapt to that new reality that you want to allow your employees to do. So establishing the goal in the end is really important, because it will be key in the third step, which is actually proposing an improvement. Because depending on what you want to do, you will not do the exact same improvement. Of course, something that saves time is always good, but if the end goal is to, let's say, lower the number of employees, you will not do the exact same changes that if you simply want to add new product offering. So it's important for the person doing the workflow analysis to be very clear about what the customers, the end user, wants to accomplish in the end. So once the goal has been properly defined and established, and I want to highlight also, it's not always very clear even to the customer what he wants to do in the end. So it's important, as the person doing the workflow analysis, to talk with the management and to really understand their goal and try to, not take it apart, but, analyze it and really understand the end goal that they're looking for in order to be able to do the best work that you can do for it. Once you have that, the second phase is analyzing the current situation. So, because we can always start with a blank page and start drawing how your business should work, but if you have no understanding of how you work today, you're going to miss stuff out. That's why the analysis is always very important. One thing that some people will say is, analysis, yeah, I know how my business works. No need to do it. But it's actually one of the most important part of it. It's because if you start doing changes, you will necessarily have bad surprises if you don't know what goes where. If I take a little image, of a real life situation, let's say this is your current kitchen. It's, well, working kitchen, it works. There's, it's not so bad, but it's not great. But, you want better. This is where you want to go. You want to transform your old one into this new kitchen. Great plan. All right. Then if you just go at it, take out a hammer and start taking down walls to prepare for your new kitchen, and you're not careful about what you're knocking down, you might knock down the support wall and you end up with this instead of being your new kitchen. So those catastrophes, the only way to avoid them is to know where you start with, and when you remove some things, that nothing is actually leaning on it and using that something before removing it. It's important in also in the analysis to scope it properly. Yes, there is a question of who is involved, which department, which group. As I said before, sometimes it can be centered on master control. Well, usually it's centered on master control in the broadcast industry, but then who else is involved? Production, traffic, sales. Sometimes we go even to distribution, like the cable companies. So it really depends on what the goal is. The goal is going to drive the scope of the analysis a lot more, because it's the wider the goal, the wider your scope needs to be in order to reach that goal. One of the things also that's extremely important when doing the analysis is you need to talk with people. Do not only use questionnaire. If someone is proposing to do a workflow analysis by using a Google survey, it won't work. You need to actually talk with people. You also should be it's very important to take copies of existing documentation to know what exists, but also it's very important not to rely on that documentation only. You need to question people, to ask them, oh, so you have a document here with, let's say, a checklist. Is that how you're doing things, what I see here? Maybe the person will tell you, yeah, we always follow the checklist. That's great. So you've got a part of your work already done. You know how they work because you have a checklist. But maybe they're going to tell you, yeah, we kind of follow it, but add extra steps here and there. And it's those little steps, that are important to understand, because you need to understand the why did they do that. That's why I often say, you want to learn the how and the what, but that's kind of easy. But what's really important is learning the why. It's not about questioning, what people do. It's more about, because most people are, they work properly, they work with good faith, and they want to do their job as best as they can. So if they do something a certain way, it may not look logical to you, but there is usually a reason. That reason may no longer be valid, may no longer be something that exists today, but there was a reason at some point, and it's important to understand that before taking it away. Also, it's important to talk with the workers. Don't simply interview managers, because sometimes there's a disconnect between what managers think their employees do and what they actually do. So they will, of course, have an idea of, the high level of what they do and a general idea of what they do, but the very specific, sometimes they're missing it. So you need to talk with the actual person doing the work. Maybe a little anecdote I can share about, learning the why. One project we worked on, I had some people extracting information, sending it to a second person who was formatting a document, a report, and sending that report to a third email address. That email address was being read by someone who had taken their retirement 2 years before. So basically, no one was reading that report anymore. So if you ask the person in the middle, why is he preparing the report? Obviously, he was asked to prepare the report, and no one had bothered to tell him that, who he was sending the report to was no longer there. So if you take it out of context, you may think, why is he wasting his time like that? But if no one told him, it's normal that he's doing it. So that's why the why is important, is very important to question during the analysis and to understand, because it will allow you to avoid missing important parts in the process. Analysis, as I said, are really about information. So when we do an analysis in a workflow, a process flow, and a flow chart, it's all about actors. So people, system, companies, what and how do they do things? Those are actions. Who do they wait on, and who do they produce information for? And it's all about also about artifacts. So whether it be Excel, XML, video files, PDF, Word documents, checklists, tapes for those of us still using those, even any kind of physical artifact that is produced during the work. So we take all of that information together, and the idea is to lay it out in a plan in a way that is visually readable, where you can see how people interact with one another. The way that it takes, usually it starts with a high-level view of the workflow, like this. So here we have every group of activities, which are the square boxes with numbers here, and we see what kind of information is being shared. For instance, let's say programming is sending a strategy to the people preparing the schedule. Those schedules are being, and they're also saying what they call master grid, and they're being sent to the people managing the media. They're sending sort of teasers for the people managing media. So we have an idea of what is being shared between not just department, but between groups of people within those departments. This one is taken from an actual example from an actual project we worked on at one of our customer, and we were working with starting from production, master control, media management, master control, and as well everything that is regulatory, so preparing reports for the regulatory body and all of that. Also, after that, each of these boxes that I've shown you here, there is a detailed view, which is this one. So we see actually who, the person or system, what do they do? So those are tasks, and what all of these tasks are producing. So for instance, when the person is preparing playlist, what comes out of the action of preparing a playlist? Well, obviously, there's a playlist. In this case, it was an Excel format playlist. That playlist was being sent to the regional stations and also being converted to CSV format for other process. So there are various steps, and between each of these steps, there is information being exchanged, and it's important to understand what is that information. Sometimes that information can be a little bit more high level, sometimes it's a bit more precise. So it's all a question of balance of deciding, what do you put in those details, what don't you put. But what is very important is those lists of elements and how they flow from one to the other. Once the analysis has been done, the next step is presenting it. It's very important to present it also to the workers. Usually, personally, that's what I start with. I do a first presentation with the workers because it allows you to validate what you understood and what you wrote in there. Because you may be very good at what you do. You meet a lot of people when you do a workflow analysis, and you take a lot of notes, and then you make those fancy drawings. But you can get things wrong. You can forget some things, and sometimes you will have misunderstood something. So it's always good to present that to workers, and it validates the key aspect. And sometimes they will pinpoint mistakes that you did. So you can correct them and make sure that your understanding of how they currently work is accurate. After that, you do a presentation to management. Very important to make sure that they share your view. Because if you do a presentation and the manager tells you, I don't know which business you worked with, but that's not my business at all, then there's a problem somewhere. You need to address that. So either you completely misunderstood, or maybe he has a big misunderstanding of how his own people are working. Once you agree that this represents the current situation, it's important to then confirm the goals. Because we've set the goals at first. You want to do more with the same amount of people. You want to expand. What is the goal? Now that you have a laid out plan of how people are working, you need to validate that goal. Because sometimes it's going to take you a bit of time to do that work, and maybe the goals have changed since then. Maybe having seen the way that they work, they decided that no, in the end, I changed my mind. I want to do this instead. So before going and doing the last phase, it's very important to confirm all of those, and then to establish a timeline. Because when you optimize and make things better, you can work at it for infinity if you want. You will always be able to make things slightly better, but so you need to establish a timeline of when you want to have it finished and what are the big steps to get there. So because as in any project, if there's no timeline, don't bother to make a plan. It won't happen. So that's why it's important. So now that the analysis phase is completed, we move down to the last phase, which is proposing and improving the workflow. So improving the workflow is work that is being done by the person doing the analysis. It's about identifying the weaknesses and recommending action items for each of them. So it's really a tandem. You identify a weakness, and then you list action items that can be more than one. Sometimes it's one for one, someone it's more than one action to fix one weakness. But you need to have various implementation elements that you can do to fix those weaknesses. It should not be very high level. It needs to be concrete. It doesn't need to be concrete to the level of saying person A walks 5 steps to go there, and it can be a little bit abstract, of course, but it still needs to be an action item. After that, once you have your list of all your action items, they should be sequenced in an order. So as I was saying, every action item should be contributing to fixing a weakness, but not all of them are as easy to implement as the other. Some of them take more time, some of them are very quick, and sometimes the best case is the very quick difference, the very quick change that give the biggest yield. Those are the ones that you want to do first, because they will give you the biggest return on the time invested. So those are naturally the ones that you will do right away. After that comes, the very, very quick one, even though the gain is smaller, since they're so quick, you can, do a few ones there. And then you have some bigger changes after that that will take, weeks, months, even sometimes years. So you lay out the order in which they should do. Personally, I also often group them, in logical groups together so that people can, know now we're working on this little group, then we're done at this little group. And each of these groups should have dates attached them, or at least a timeline attached them, so that everyone knows that for the next 3 weeks we're working on this list. After that, we should be working on that list, etc., etc. It's also important to propose a target workflow. And obviously, the target workflow should have as little bottleneck as possible. The classic example is if everyone is producing 20,000 documents, sending it to one guy, and that guy redispatches it to everyone, well, that guy, he's being overworked. If he takes a sick day, nothing happens for while he's gone. So those kind of bottlenecks are very important to be avoided by distributing work as evenly as possible between various entities within the specialty of each of those entities, of course. Sorry. So the changes can be of many various type of changes. So they can be a change in the way that people use existing technology. So they will have, they're used to a certain tool, they may be using it in a certain way, but sometimes there are functionalities that they're not aware of or they decided not to use for various reasons. So we can propose to use those features to work better. Sometimes it can be about introducing new technology or new tools to the job. It can be also about introducing documentation or checklist. That's often an area that is overlooked because, especially in smaller teams, everyone tends to work their own way, which is good in a sense. However, it works because everyone in the team knows how the other one works. So as the team grows, or when you change the team members, the new people joining have no clue how the other person works. So that creates a lot of inefficiency and it slows down things a lot. So by introducing simple, reminders and checklists, people are able to understand how everyone else is working, and everyone works in a more standardized way, so it's more efficient and they work better. A quick trap not to fall into, however, a checklist should not be, too precise because you need the large step. It needs to be a balance. But if you're too precise, people will be too forced into a way of working that doesn't allow them to work their best. So it needs to be flexible enough so that everyone can adapt to it well, but also to have the large steps so that everyone works in relatively the same way. The other type of action item that we see a lot is to automate certain things. Now, one thing, when we look at some series on Netflix, we see that AI is growing and is becoming smarter than human. At this point in reality, AI is not about to replace humans anytime soon. However, there are some tasks which are either uninteresting, highly repetitive, and that don't require specific human decision-making or this human, mind for. Those can be automated. So those are usually easily automated and they will save a lot of time. And the thing is, most of the workers doing those tasks, they actually don't necessarily want to do it. I've seen cases, when there was a manufacturing plant with bottles, with the bottles going by on a conveyor super fast in front of him. The guy was looking at them, trying to spot if a bottle was not filled to capacity. That can clearly be automated. The sensor will probably do a better job at spotting problems. And, well, you won't be giving headaches and eye problems to a poor person who's watching bottles go by day in and day out. Whereas his time can be used much more efficiently in a much better way, supervising other things which does require human intervention. So as I was saying, all of those changes, you need also to present them. and it is important to present them. Usually it takes the form of a drawing like I shown you before, where you see all of the tasks and how they flow together. And when you present those changes, first of all, of course, you need to validate them with management, because they are the ones deciding if they want to go ahead or not. But once you decide to go ahead, change management is really key to success here. And I'm referring to change management like we're referring in other areas. So it means you need to inform people of what the changes are going to be, when are they going to happen, train them for them, give them the help in order to adapt and transform. You can't simply, take someone who's been working a certain way for 15 years and tell him, tomorrow we do it differently. It's like, okay, and then just tell him, now we do it this way, and you walk out and let him do it that new way. It won't happen. The person will need time to understand the change, to adapt to it, and he needs to be accompanied in order for that to be as efficient and as possible, to done as good as possible. It's also very important to get feedback from the workers, because even the most well thought out plan, sometimes things don't go the way that you're expecting it to go. So it's important to get feedback from the employees, because sometimes a change that you thought would take, 3 weeks, in the end, after 3 weeks, you realize you're just halfway there. You may still need another 2 or 3 weeks. That's fine, it happens, but it's important to be aware of those and to be able to adapt your plan to reality. Otherwise, you will deviate from the plan and the end result will never happen. So it's all about follow-up, basically, and adaptability. It's also very important to go at the right pace. That's something that is often overlooked. If you go too slow, then nothing changed, it stays the same, and people just disengage. They say, oh, it's the same as it's always been, and they just start participating in the change. But if you're too quick, then you're going to spend all of your time not actually implementing the change, but fighting the people, the employee and the people working on it on the change. So it's all about balance and finding the right pace for those changes. I'll finish with highlighting a few areas, where we often see room for improvement, especially in the broadcast industry. File format are one. That's usually an obvious one, because everyone is aware of time it takes to transcode and transfer and ingest files. So by changing file format, sometimes you can gain a lot of time for various reasons, but it's not always as clear-cut as you might think, because the choice of a file format is very involving, and there's multiple facets to why you're choosing a specific format. So that one of the more important reasons why you need to understand everything in the ecosystem before changing those formats. Methods of file transfer, FTP, disk, byte courier, or whatever way you're transferring those files can have a big impact on the way you work. Report generation, and in general, all the time involved and invested into collecting information, processing that information, arranging it, and presenting it in a report, there is a lot of time involved in those elements. The biggest waste of time comes, for the example I gave you before of the person preparing a report for someone no longer working there. Usually it's not as obvious as that one, but there are sometimes a lot of reports that have kind of the same information onto it, so you're often able to merge reports together. So, if you have 3 entities using this kind of relatively the same information, you are often able to generate a single report with all the information needed by all 3 destinations, and everyone will be able to use the same report. So you just save the time that you were using to create, instead of creating 3 reports, you're creating 1. So by doing those little changes, you are able to gain a lot of time. When it comes to regulatory reports, sometimes a little bit more strict and fixed, because there's a little bit less latitude of what you can do, but there's still ways to work with it and adapt. Non-standardized ways of working, as I touched to that before, it's causing sometimes confusion between workers, and no one knows exactly what the other person is doing at what time, and everyone is expecting the other person to work the way they do, but they don't. So overall, that will generate problems. One of the typical type of problems that it will generate is you will discover problems in many situations, because most software that are being used in the broadcast industry, they're highly specialized. They may be very common, but they're not, consumer type of software where there's dozens of millions of copies sold every year, because there's just so many TV stations, in the country. So if you start poking at it and trying to break it, often you will be able to break it. So if everyone works in a different way, then you can have one person discovering that if they do it this way, oh, there's a problem, when everyone else does not have the problem. And by ensuring that everyone works the same way, you find a recipe that works and everyone copies the same recipe and everyone works at the same level of proficiency when they do their work, in the same level of results. So I hope that you've enjoyed the presentation today. There wasn't any questions, so if there are any questions now, please feel free to raise your hand and let me know. And thank you for being with us.